Cancer Council in New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians, both past and present, of the lands on which we live and work. Welcome to you all. My name's Jill Mills, and tonight we'll be talking about work and cancer and managing those difficult conversations that you sometimes have to have at work when you are diagnosed with cancer. So tonight, a few housekeeping things. If you have any technical problems with your sound or reception or whatever, you can mention in the chat box, or you can call the 1800 733 416 number, which will pop up in the chat box for you. So we encourage you to use the chat box, share discussion with each other. If you get distracted at all, it doesn't matter. We send you a recording and you can watch the webinar again later. So it is being recorded and the webinar will be emailed out to you with some resources as well of some of the things that we talk about tonight. So if at any stage you feel you need to speak to someone urgently, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14, which is available 24/7. So let's get started. With me sitting here at the panel is Mubarak and Sally, and dialing in you'll see Bogda on the screen there. So please, we're about to start, and Annie Miller is in the chat box. If you have any questions, she's sitting there ready to chat to you as well. So I'm going to pass the mouse over to Sally, who works at Cancer Council New South Wales in our pro bono department, and she's going to tell you a little bit about that work. So I'll give you the mouse.
Thanks, Jill, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking to you tonight. As Jill mentioned, I work in the Cancer Council pro bono team. Through the pro bono program, we connect people who are affected by cancer with professionals to assist with legal, financial, small business, and relevantly for this webinar, workplace issues where they otherwise couldn't afford to pay for advice. So I'm not an HR specialist myself. What my role tonight is to talk about a couple of brief case studies, stories about difficult conversations that people have had with employers. They are based on real life stories, but de-identified. So names and some details have been changed, and then I'll pass to Mubarak and Bogda, who'll provide some comment through their lens of expertise. The first case study I wanted to talk to you about is Andrew's story. When Andrew was...
Just click through to it on the screen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, hang on, let's bring that back. You know, just give it back to me for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah. Going.
So I'll keep going with Andrew's story. When Andrew was referred to us, he was employed on a full-time basis as a logistics officer at a transport company. He'd recently been diagnosed with lung cancer and he needed to take time off work for treatment. Andrew let us know that he'd told his employer about his diagnosis, but during that conversation, and it certainly sounded like a difficult conversation, his manager had let him know that he needed to work through treatment, essentially that they were understaffed and that they couldn't spare him. Now, this was very stressful for Andrew, not least because on top of everything else, he had to travel at least 3 hours for treatment, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to juggle that with his work commitments. He raised this with his manager. His manager's response was essentially, "Not my problem, mate." So Andrew's worry was not only around his ability to fulfil his obligations as an employee, but he was also genuinely concerned that he might lose his income at a time when medical costs and other costs were already building up. Now, Andrew felt his manager was unsympathetic to his situation, fairly felt this, I think, and that he'd been unreasonably inflexible. But Andrew didn't have the confidence to really stand up for himself and push back, I guess. So that's when Andrew came to us seeking advice around his rights to flexible work, advice around discrimination in the workplace, and some practical tips to have another difficult conversation with his manager so that he could really negotiate a way forward with them. And at that point I might throw to you, Mubarak, to talk about some practical tips for having these types of difficult conversations.
Do you want me to move through to the
Yes,
slide?
please.
Here's the slide introducing Mubarak, who is an HR specialist, also working at Cancer Council. So welcome.
Thank you. So the case study presented is something that is something that tends to occur quite frequent in the workplace. The difficult conversations with an employee and their manager. And I suppose the question around that is how do we then manage difficult conversations at the workplace? So there are some practical tips and techniques that you can look to adopt to help you have that difficult discussion. And we're going to look at some of them right now. So there are 4 questions I ask individuals to consider when preparing or wanting to manage a difficult conversation at work. And certainly the first question that is asked is, what is the purpose? So thinking about and writing, what is the ideal outcome that you'd like to achieve through that conversation? This provides some, this helps you in terms of entering the conversation with a clear purpose, but also helping to frame the conversation with the individual. So in Andrew's case, it will help him frame the discussion with his manager in terms of what would be an ideal outcome for Andrew. It's also important to note that without having a clear idea of what you'd like to achieve, or without having a purpose, it's difficult to achieve the ideal outcome. The other point or question I do ask individuals to consider is what is their emotional state? So consider what is their emotional attachment to the situation. If the individual does have a strong emotional attachment, certainly consider bringing a neutral person into the discussion. And the reason for that, it allows for certainly support, but also an objective view in terms of working towards a collaborative outcome. The third question that I do ask individuals to consider, particularly around managing difficult conversations, is how might they be able to influence the conversation? So this is about considering your attitude and your perception of the conversation that you're about to have. And what's important to note here is when you have a negative mind frame, it then becomes quite challenging to achieve your ideal outcomes. So really trying to maintain a positive outlook in terms of entering into a conversation that might be potentially difficult certainly helps you to achieve your outcome. Now, we do appreciate that you cannot get rid of your emotions, but what you can do is be aware of them so you're better able to manage them through the conversation that you have. So the last question I do ask people to consider when dealing with difficult conversations in the workplace is, what might the other person be thinking? So this is important to understand what information the other person might need to know. What might they be willing to agree on in terms of your ideal outcome? And also, in terms of managing the conversation, really getting them involved in identifying a potential solution for this. This is certainly to drive the discussion or steer the conversation in a more collaborative direction, so that when an outcome is agreed, it's supported by both parties. So those are some of the tips and strategies I would ask you to consider, certainly to help you manage challenging conversations in the workplace, but also to really look at, I suppose one of the things I would encourage you to do is also look at your internal resources within the workplace. So looking at your HR department and the support that they can offer you in terms of achieving your ideal outcome. And bear in mind that the role of HR is not only to work with the organization, but it's also as an employee advocate. So they're really to provide you with that support, with information in terms of what options that you can explore to help support your situation. On that note, I might just pass it on.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess we can talk about this a bit later, but often, especially when you're either going through cancer treatment or finish your treatment, your emotional state's often very high and you're feeling very stressed. So we'll talk about that, I guess, a little bit later. And the other thing that's come up in the questions is if it's a small business, there may not be an HR department. So again, we'll talk about that a bit more because I'm sure there's people sitting at home thinking about those two points.
And that's a very good point actually to draw upon. So
yeah, but we'll come up on those again. So I'll just click through. So we're going to do the next case study now, and I'll click through for you, Sally.
Thanks, Jill.
So,
and I think it's worth noting too that these conversations obviously are difficult, and it's why we're having this discussion this evening. They are sensitive, and it's one of the reasons that I'm here talking about our case studies rather than someone coming here to tell you their story. I'll just touch on the outcome of Andrew's case. Actually, we were able to refer Andrew to a human resources specialist who was able to give him some advice and practical tips for communicating with his employer, as Mubarak has just gone through, so that Andrew felt he could regain some control in that discussion. Andrew felt that having an understanding of what his rights were and what the company policy was armed him with enough confidence and knowledge to escalate the matter, request another meeting with his direct manager and the HR team to further negotiate flexible work arrangements. Ultimately, he was given 3 months off to focus on treatment, and he was able to return to work on a flexible part-time basis. He was also given an apology for the initial lack of support that he'd received, which actually meant a lot to Andrew. So I think, these conversations are difficult and it is sensitive, but they're very important to have them. The next story we wanted to tell you was about Mary. Thanks, Jill, for clicking through to the slide. Mary came to us for recruitment advice. She had completed her treatment for breast cancer and she wanted to return to work after 12 months out of the workforce. She'd actually resigned from her previous role as a nurse because she felt that the physical and emotional demands that it placed on her were just too much for her at that particular time. So Mary had an interview for a new role as an administrative officer at a mental health organisation, but she was concerned and really quite stressed about the interview process. She was wondering whether she had to disclose her past diagnosis to her prospective employer, and even if she didn't, whether that would actually be a good idea because it might mean that she could have open conversations about strategies to manage her return to work if she did get the job. Now, open dialogue was very important to Mary. She was concerned that she may not be able to process information as well as she used to because she was still experiencing some fatigue and chemo brain side effects as part of her treatment, and she had trouble concentrating for long periods of time. Mary wanted to be as transparent as possible about this so that she could access support if she needed to without experiencing any additional stress. So this was really important to Mary, but she was concerned about what she expected would be quite a difficult conversation in terms of addressing those issues.
Yeah, look, there are two parts to that case study that we can look at. The first being having time off and then looking to return to the workplace. So how do you sort of make that transition? And one of the first things I would ask you to consider is it's a good opportunity to reset, so reevaluate your career goals. Think about what it is you would like to be doing. And that will help you then identify potential roles that you can look at, and that will save you a ton of time, energy, and frustration if you have a target to work towards. The other thing you would want to look at is developing a return to work plan. So that is actually about you being aware in terms of your capacity to return to work, what that may look like, and in turn that will help you then identify what roles you should be targeting, and again saving you a lot of time, energy, and frustration. You also want to review your skills. So where is your skill set compared to where the requirements are at that present point in time? So making a list of all the skills that you currently have, your experience, what you've done, then helps you to understand where the gaps may be, and then you can work on taking steps to really upskilling yourself to be a qualified candidate for any roles that you identify. And the next step you want to look at is investing in your network. Now, this is crucial for anyone that's been that has had extensive time off. And this really allows you to look at those individuals that can act as an advocate for you, particularly around providing recommendations and validations of your skills and abilities. It's also important to make a concerted effort to also connect with family, because family are able to play an important role in helping you on that journey to return to work. The other part I'd like to explore is, if you are in a role, should you then be looking at, and I'm not sure if I'm jumping the gun here, but
okay.
Should you be looking at disclosing your illness to your employer? What are the obligations there? Now, there are no legal obligations for you to disclose your illness to your employer. However, what you need to consider is the impact that might have in terms of your relationship with your employer, particularly around your role and the inherent requirements of your role. And as an example, if you have a role that requires you to travel quite extensively, however, due to treatment and other appointments, medical appointments that you need to attend, you aren't able to travel as extensively, or you might need to take time off. It becomes difficult not disclosing that to your employer, because without the context, then they might deem it to be a performance issue. So just bearing in mind and understanding your role, information your employer needs to be aware of, and then how can you actually work together in terms of finding an amicable solution.
Yeah. And I think the issue of disclosure came up in the chat box a few minutes ago as well. And as we were talking about before, I mean, if somebody's in a physical working role and they have, surgery, or they're having treatment that really means they physically cannot perform that role, and that's when, you're looking at the slide, maybe that's when you've got to start reevaluating your career goals and doing some retraining. So, and if it becomes a risk for your job because of your ability to work, you really need to tell your employer then. I think there is a bit of a legal obligation, is there not, in that case?
Where it means you can't perform the inherent requirements of your role. That's limited circumstances where you would need to tell your employer.
Yeah. So did you want to go back and tell the outcome of
Yeah,
Mary?
absolutely. So
Yeah.
in terms of Mary, we, through the pro bono program, and it is a national program, I should mention, we were able to refer her on to a recruitment specialist who was able to give her advice around communicating with prospective employers, around the interview process, around some of the issues that Mubarak has touched on in terms of how do you go about finding a new role when you might have been in a role for a long time and taken a significant period out. So they gave us some tips around that and communication, and they were able to work with her to develop a written return to work plan, which meant that Mary felt a lot more empowered to embrace new opportunities. And in this case, Mary was successful in getting a role, which was great.
Yeah, a good outcome.
Yes.
And I think, just going back again, talking about if you work for a small business, and that you can actually go and see an HR consultant, because, as I said, there may not be an HR department, but there are external consultants that you can go and see to get advice.
Or career counsellors or other external professionals.
Yeah,
absolutely. And certainly in this day and age, there's plenty of resources available for individuals. So you can go onto the Fair Work site. There's plenty of information there. There's a contact number, and they can also provide information in terms of your rights. Again, encouraging individuals to think about, and I think when it comes to understanding or to working towards an ideal outcome, It's really thinking about what it is you would like and how and what role would you like your employer to play in that. Oftentimes, where there is, in Andrew's case, where there tends to be a bit of tension is because both parties aren't clear in terms of the overall objectives of that conversation. So Andrew might be clear, but without the framing of that conversation to his manager, it becomes difficult for the manager to understand what it is that's required. So certainly making the effort on framing the conversation up front around, in Andrew's case, I'd like to explore options of flexible work and taking some time off, then allows him to really direct the conversation to a more collaborative or in a more collaborative direction. So those are some things you certainly want to consider when engaging in a potentially difficult conversation.
And I think your tips too about perhaps having a support person with you, whether it's someone internal to the company or the HR team, and thinking about where you want to have that conversation, making sure it's in a quiet room and it's at a good time, that can be really important because, as you said, the HR team should be there as partly an employee advocates. And I think, if that initial conversation that Andrew had, if there was someone else there, it might have gone quite differently.
Absolutely. And certainly, also being aware of your emotional state. And it is quite difficult because if you are in a heightened state of emotions, you have a strong emotional attachment. It is quite difficult having these discussions, particularly if the other party does not seem to show any empathy to your situation. And having a neutral person in that discussion helps to balance that out a bit.
Okay. Well, we're handing over to Bogda now. Good evening to you, Bogda, down in Adelaide. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me tonight. Thank you for joining me. I hear it's raining in Sydney. It's still sunny here.
Lucky.
Look, I'm a medical oncologist, so I look at the issues of work and cancer from the perspective of the patients that come through my office. And I think that the cases that we've discussed very nicely illustrate some of the key issues, and that is that the issue of work and cancer really varies from individual to individual. For some people, it is the question of stopping work when the cancer diagnosis arrives. For others, it's returning to work after. For others, it's actually how you work during treatment, and anything and everything. So what I'd like to do just for a moment is pull out some of the key themes that we've already alluded to, just to kind of set the scene and maybe just put a little bit of a background information to some of the questions that you all have. But one point that I would make regarding the cases is, it's worth remembering that when the issue of work and cancer springs to mind, it is often something that takes us all by surprise. It's the person with cancer might think, what does it mean? How is it going to impact on me? And will it impact on me? Maybe not. Maybe it will. The doctor might be asked, should I be working? And you think to yourself, well, should I be working as an aircraft engineer? And I'm thinking, well, I don't know what aircraft engineers do. Do I have the sufficient knowledge and expertise to advise? I might know about cancer, but not necessarily about employment law or human relations. And the employer is in exactly the same position. That might be the very first employee with cancer that comes to them for advice. So it's worth remembering that we all taken a little bit by surprise, and sometimes we really need to go back and actually reflect on things, seek more information. What does the job involve? What are the obligations and responsibilities? And so if I were to offer one suggestion, it is worth recognizing that this is a complex issue and that we all need to do a bit of thinking. What are my goals as a patient? what do I need to know about my patient for the doctor, and what is it that we're trying to do in the workplace for the employer. And that really means sometimes just agreeing to say, we don't know how to sort it out, but let's talk again when we have a little bit more information. So let's see whether I can move the slides. Yes, I can. I'm just going to take you through some of the key points regarding work and cancer. And the first one is things vary from individual to individual depending on what cancer you have, what kind of employment you have. It's also what your expectations about employment might be. It's also not just about returning to work, but working, and the work really relates to not just how much you work, but how well you work and how easy the work is and how meaningful and enjoyable it is. So again, it's a complex issue. How you work has impact on how much money you bring, and cancer often puts additional strain on your finances. So work is important, but it's also for many of us an issue of meaning, who you are, how you spend your time, and those two things are related. So in general, work is valuable for many different reasons, but it can also be challenging. And it's worth reflecting, is it that I really want to work or I have to work, and how do those things balance out? And sadly, today, we as a society could do better with regards to how we address those issues. And I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about what could be done, but there is still a lot that could be done better. Why do things differ? Different cancers have different impact. If you have just a minor surgery to remove the cancer, you may not be profoundly affected, but if you have major surgery, reconstruction, if you have chemotherapy, if you have side effects like chemo brain, you might be affected more, and that impact may last for a short time or long time. So it varies from person to person, and getting accurate medical advice is very important. Different people have different jobs. Your job might be very responsible, where a lot of thinking is required, or you might work in a job that provides a lot of flexibility. You might be a farmer where not only your field, but your entire livestock depends on you, whether you're well or not well, and you may not have income protection insurance. So the challenges really vary. Your abilities to retrain or get a different job may vary as well. And you might have different preferences about work. It's different story if you're planning to retire anyway in the near future, and the diagnosis just shifts that about a few months. It's different if you were planning to get your first ever most wonderful job, and after graduating from university, and suddenly you have to detour to have cancer treatment. So circumstances vary, and the impact on what is important for work for all of us. And there are, of course, different societal expectations and the law around it. Probably the most obvious one is that there are gender issues of what is expected of men or women with regards to employment, how many of them would work, different genders would work part-time or in casual positions, and your job security and what is expected of you in a setting of cancer might impact of how you plan your work. It's worth stressing out that it's not just how much you work, but also how well you work. And here, there's a very, very important balance about ensuring that there is a safety and well-being of a person who is employed against the safety of those who the employee works with and who she works for. And I can probably give an example of here. I once had a patient who really wanted to continue working because work provided a lot of meaning to her. She interacted with people, she felt helpful, the job was one of the best things in her life. But as it happened, she worked on a hospital switchboard where she would have to take emergency calls when there was a major hospital emergency to to assemble the resuscitation team, for example. And one of the problems that she experienced as part of her health is that periodically she would have a blackout, completely unexpectedly. She couldn't predict it, but she would black out for a minute or two, and then she would recover. And we had a long discussion about the fact that as much as work was desirable for her, working at the hospital switchboard may not be necessarily the best employment option for her, because if there was a medical emergency requiring a resus team at the time when she had a blackout, then that would be devastating for the hospital and devastating for her. So we sort of looked at strategies of looking at alternative ways of finding employment and maintaining meaning, but ensuring that those two sometimes competing goals are reconciled in a work plan. There is a relatively new term that emerges in cancer research, and that is financial toxicity, and it relates to the fact that cancer treatment can predispose to toxicities in many different ways. Many of you might be familiar with nausea and vomiting of chemotherapy as a common toxicity, but there is a financial toxicity where the cancer treatment really hits your pocket and your wallet. And while we tend to talk about financial toxicity from the perspective of cost of cancer treatment, work or inability to work really impacts on ability to have enough income to pay for cancer treatments, and therefore on financial toxicity. And what's apparent is that financial toxicity impacts not just on patients themselves, but their family, their partners, their carers, parents, so their entire family might be affected. And today, we often don't talk about it because it's often not very easy. For me as an oncologist, it's quite hard to predict of what would be the impact on employment of a particular cancer treatment. And I think we need to get better at it, but at the moment, it's not necessarily such an easy task. And yet, we're beginning to recognize that this concept of financial toxicity really impacts on how well people feel and potentially how well and how long they live. So this is not a trivial issue. So lastly, we could do better. I think that the potential strategies of addressing these issues are to provide more information, and there is a website that I'll show you in a second that we've developed that focuses on work after cancer, that gives some useful information on a variety of topics relating to employment. I think we need to train healthcare providers and employers of how to handle those difficult conversations, how to develop work return plans. We need to assist people in rehabilitating them in return to work. We need to advocate for change in terms of policy and regulations and greater awareness of these issues. There are opportunities for clinical practice and research that relate to measuring how much work or inability to work impacts on well-being. We need to study these issues, and we need to design better strategies of how to deal with them. So this is the example of the website, workaftercancer.com.au. Check it out. It's got lots of information, and you can see that information is separated for patients, their carers, healthcare providers, and employers. And it might gives you links of existing resources that exist elsewhere, but in one sort of convenient location. So I think that gives you a little bit of kind of issues that need to be identified around work. And I think now we probably have opportunity to answer some questions that are a little bit more specific.
Thank you, Bogda. That's great information. And I think having the basis for all these ideas of things that can be done with research hopefully will flow through to the workplace and help people, I guess, get treated in the way that they need to be at work. So we've kind of, the first question here, we've sort of covered a little bit about when you're in a small workplace, so raising the issue in a small workplace, whether or not you've got anything, Bogda, with your experience with patients you've had, whether or not there's any more comment. Yeah.
I might add a comment on that, and I think Bogda raised certainly a good point or a good takeaway at the end there when we looked at the website, particularly with small employers that might not have experience with these incidents, that providing them with that information, informing them, will help in terms of managing the situation. Oftentimes, I think there's an expectation that the employer would have the answers. So certainly there's an opportunity to take the initiative and provide the information to sort of drive a more collaborative approach to achieving an outcome that's good for both parties.
And certainly just because you're in a small workplace doesn't mean you have different rights to anyone else. You have the same rights. So I think informing yourself and looking at websites like the Work After Cancer website is very important.
Yeah. The next one, looking at explaining the gap, I guess, on your CV when you're applying, if you're applying for new jobs. And again, this sort of goes to disclosure and without over-explaining, because sometimes people may get carried away and explaining too much, giving too much information. So I guess finding that balance with your experience, Zubair, that gap is when someone's applying for a job is a difficult one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be a difficult one to speak to, particularly at interview. So certainly having a bit of practice beforehand, and it can be with just jotting down or asking yourself the questions prior to applying for jobs, as in how would I address that? Certainly the information that people, as a HR professional, one of the things I would be keen to understand is, where are you now in terms of your mindset to re-enter the workforce? Certainly, if an individual chooses to disclose that they were off due to a cancer illness, it's more around understanding where the mindset is to return to the workplace. And if an individual chooses not to disclose that, it does make it a bit more challenging in terms of understanding what had transpired through that period and why an individual had not been employed. I would certainly encourage individuals to be, depending on their comfort levels, to be open and honest around why they've had the time off and how they are now ready to re-enter the workforce.
I guess the point about the fatigue as well, if they've got an ongoing fatigue issue happening, that's a tricky one too, I think.
That is, and certainly you then want to start looking at their return to work plan. So, something that they could put together around understanding what their capacity for work is. What can they do? Bogdan, you mentioned the example of the person working in the hospital then enjoyed their job, however, had blackouts and taking calls. Realistically, is that something that you can continue doing? If you are currently employed, then it may be a discussion with your employer around what might suitable duties look like until such time that I can return to my incumbent role. So certainly being open to exploring other avenues is what I would say.
Bogdan, have you got anything you want to add to that?
I think it's very important to look at the consequences of different actions. I think that I understand why people often get very anxious about disclosure of their diagnosis because they do not want to be assumed as incapable, or it might be too intrusive and they want to protect their privacy. But the converse is working in an environment where you cannot openly talk to people about who you are and what is happening to you and what your needs are is a very difficult, constraining environment that is also very stressful and quite tough in the long run. And I think that you would hope that your employer will be supportive and will value the skills that you bring into the job. And in that setting, they should be able to manage with the information that you disclose. Again, if I were to throw an anecdote, I can think of a patient of mine who really needed to work. She had a mortgage to pay. She worked as a receptionist, and she was incredibly fatigued, so much so that she would run her daily job tasks, and at lunchtime she would walk into her car, take an set up alarm on the phone, and sleep for half an hour, and then get up and go back to work. And nobody really knew of how tough things were for her. And that is one way of kind of maintaining your employment, but it seems so terribly, terribly tough. It begs the question of how long can you do that for? And I would hope that if people knew about how hard it is, then they might have, whether it would be co-workers or their employer or whatever, they might actually have some sympathy and understanding, and maybe occasionally bring a cup of tea or say, do you want to take 5 minutes during your working day? So, living with cancer is hard enough, and hiding it from everybody is much, much harder.
Asking, should I disclose at interview or when I've got the job? Because if I disclose at interview, does that mean I might not get the job? So it encompasses exactly what you're saying, Bogda, about not hiding it.
And here, what it comes down to, certainly at interview, you are assessing the individual's capability, but you're also assessing the individual's motivation and where they are in terms of their mindset to engage with the employer. So not disclosing it, but being aware of the inherent requirements of the role, and should you not be able to perform the inherent requirements of the role, poses a challenge. So that's something individuals need to be mindful of. And certainly when you work in identifying roles that you may look to apply for, you're certainly considering your ability to perform those roles, given your condition and where you are. So certainly those are points to consider upfront. And hopefully that allows you to identify roles that actually match up with where you are in your recovery.
Yeah, sound advice. Next question here. Obviously looking at where a manager's disclosed information to other staff, and it's obviously, by the sound of what's happening here, it's a continuing impact. It's a difficult one to answer, managing that.
The first thing I'll call out there is personal medical information conditions should not be disclosed without the consent of the individual. So if there is a situation, speak to your HR department. If you're in a smaller organization that does not have a HR department, seek to speak to a senior member of management to raise awareness and address this concern, and hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, again, we're talking about difficult conversations. What conversations should you have with your work colleagues about this? Is it best to have the conversation, or just leave it to management to sort it out?
And again, it comes back to understanding the role that the individual is performing, and also that there's a requirement to look after the safety not only of the individual, but those around them in the work setting. So if there is going to be a risk that the condition might impact on the safety of others, then there will need to be a discussion with the wider staff around, we need to be mindful of this. However, before we embark on that discussion, the manager should sit down with the individual to talk through that and understand, well, what are our options in terms of addressing this? Or is the solution that we look at a more an alternate role that provides suitable duties?
Thank you. And then I guess it goes back to maybe going to the website, the Work After Cancer website, about ensuring managers have access to information. And I'm sure, Bogda, whether on the Work After Cancer website there is information there for employers.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's certainly information for employers with regards to how to support employees, how the colleagues at work can support somebody with cancer, how to sort of direct people to appropriate resources, what are the legal obligations, what are the potential financial sort of strategies for support, etc. So there is quite a lot of resources that are directed specifically at employers in the Australian context.
It would be a good idea that an employee may say to the employer, go and have a look at this website.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got still got a bit of time, so we have got some more questions. There were quite a few questions, which I have here. We sort of skipped over that travel one a little bit though, didn't we? It's up on the screen there, and we did touch on it earlier. So travelling to work, and we can't talk about travel insurance because that's really not what we're here to talk about. But I think, and again, this goes to disclosure about travelling and work. So did you want to comment and look just briefly on that one? Yeah.
Sure. And again, I think we touched on it earlier in terms of understanding, the role requirements. So if there is a lot of travel that's required in order to perform the role, certainly there needs to be a discussion and consideration in terms of the individual's capacity to perform the role. Particularly around if there are a need for the individual, if there is a need for the individual to attend medical appointments or a need for them to take time off. They would then need to disclose their inability to travel to their employer so that they could sort of work on managing the situation and coming up with a suitable arrangement. Oftentimes what we find is there's a lack of awareness. So certainly the perception from management is that an individual is being difficult without fully being aware of the situation. So just being mindful of that it is important to provide context, to educate yourself and then inform your employer in terms of reaching a solution that works for both parties.
Yeah. So there's a question here which I'll read out. So can employers be required to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate treatment needs and light duties during employee treatment and recovery? So it's kind of, I guess, a legal sort of question. And is refusal classed as indirect discrimination on perceived disability grounds? So, Sally?
Yes is the answer. Employers are required to make reasonable adjustments if necessary to allow you to perform the role
that you've been employed to do.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's having, if you do want to challenge that, I guess having the courage to challenge it. And again, with the pro bono team, you can get support to help do that if that's the path you choose to go down.
Yeah, that's right. And just to give you another anecdote, we had a client, and again, some details have been changed around this, who worked in a retail store. A very small component of her role was adjusting mannequins. So she worked in a clothes shop. She wasn't able to do that while she was receiving treatment for breast cancer, but her manager refused to accommodate that and work around it, essentially. So wouldn't make any adjustments to what they saw as the parameters of her role. This was a client who was referred through to the pro bono program, and we were able to refer her on to an employment lawyer who had expertise in employment law, who was able to assist her with that.
Thanks, Sally. And this one might be a good one for you, Bogda, and it's kind of what you touched on earlier, and it's saying, how do we assess whether my husband is ready to go back into the workforce? So I guess that's a physical, medical, also probably a psychological.
Sure. There on the website, there is a section specifically geared for healthcare professionals with regards to assessment of fitness to work, and a reasonably straightforward strategy, a straightforward situation like this could be handled by any doctor, but sometimes additional specialized expertise is required that can be provided by either occupational therapists or by occupational physicians, where because really the assessment of fitness to work is a function of what a person can do and also what the job requires. So you have to understand what the job is all about to be able to understand what might be needed. But there is a structure around it that can guide a healthcare professional in assessing some of those things, and a very similar sort of dot point of issues can be used by anybody in thinking about their own work performance. These are sort of sometimes very simple things of, can I sit for a long time? Can I stand for a long time? How long before I need to take a break? What is a reasonable ability to sort of pick things up, or ability to sort of see things or remember or calculate or whatever, depending really what your job tasks are. So the website gives some specific examples of how that could be done that might be useful for healthcare professionals, but can also give anybody a bit of a starting point in assessment.
So again, would you suggest if somebody is consulting with their GP, or it might even be a specialist, and they're not sure, to direct them to the website to have a look at that structure?
Yes. And the website also has a link to occupational therapists and occupational physicians who have very sophisticated level of expertise in it. So, for example, if you're dealing with somebody who's got either very complex physical or sort of mental needs with regards to work capacity, or have a very complex job where those needs need to be evaluated, then there is expertise available to do that the right way.
That actually is fantastic, because it sort of lends itself to, if someone's looking to return to the workforce after some time off, having that return to work plan would line up with having that medical assessment done, so you understand what you can actually be looking to do in returning to the workforce.
And how it might evolve going forward.
Absolutely.
And it probably armed with that, when you go to have that difficult conversation, that you've got this document, I guess, from your health professional with the team you're with, to say to your employer, this is my situation.
Absolutely.
Being upfront, I guess, about it.
Absolutely. And certainly, going back to the flexible or reasonable adjustments, I think the key word there is reasonable. So what is reasonable? Working with your employer to understand what are reasonable adjustments can certainly help in terms of achieving a good outcome.
I guess you've got to have in your own mind what's reasonable. You need to be reasonable as well as the employer.
Absolutely. So it works both ways.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we'll move on. So again, Cancer Council has some information about the workplace as well. All these links we'll email you through to you with the resources. We have books and online PDFs and ebooks about work and cancer, and fact sheets and things we'll click through here. We have also some of the questions that were asked. We have conducted other webinars about workplace and cancer, which you can have a look on our website. Again, we'll send you those links. But here's just an example of some of the books. We've just, the Cancer Work and You book has just been revised and just re-released in the last month. So there's all updated information in there, and there's all the fact sheets and things. So there's a lot of information online. The website Bogged is referred to. It's good, reliable, evidence-based information. And again, the information we provide is also reliable and evidence-based. And of course, as you're going through all this, you can ring 13 11 20 and ask for advice. If you're interested in the pro bono scheme, if you're wanting to talk to somebody, they refer you to that scheme. We have a new online community where you can go and chat to people and blog and share information. So Bob, just as we're winding up here, anything else that you would like to contribute to the audience?
I think it's just worth remembering that 2 points. One is, for many people who suffer a temporary setback with their employment, majority improve their employment capacity, quality, the amount of work that they do. So if you're kind of stuck in a situation where you're worried of how you're doing, don't lose heart. Most of the time things get better. And the second thing is there are many different ways of achieving meaningful employment. So don't feel that there is only one job for you. And sometimes if you're in a job that is really tough or maybe not the right fit for you at the moment, changing to a different one is the right way forward. So I hope that you remember the sort of the positive messages, because that's the more dominant theme. And for those of us who provide care and support in that space, there is so much more that we could do.
But we're working towards that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. We have an exit survey that's going to pop up when we finish. We would love you to complete it. It only takes a couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes, where we just ask you a few questions about the content tonight, and we just try and work out, you know, as we're moving forward, how we can make our webinars better, and that we have actually provided some information to you that's going to be helpful to you. So I'd like to say thank you to the panel. Thank you, Mubarak and Sally and Bogda, for coming in from Adelaide, from sunny Adelaide. And we'll say good evening to everybody, and thank you, Annie, in the chat box. It's been quite busy, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.